The emergency room at Phoenix Memorial Hospital had witnessed countless tragedies, but what unfolded on that sweltering August evening would shatter everything the medical staff believed about the boundaries between silence and revelation. A 9-year-old boy who had never uttered a single syllable would finally find his voice. The person he chose to address, and the 4 words that would escape his lips, would unravel a web of deception so intricate that it would topple one of Arizona's most influential business dynasties and alter the trajectory of dozens of lives forever. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The late afternoon sun cast long shadows across the marble floors of the Blackwood estate, its rays filtering through the floor-to-ceiling windows of the mansion's grand library. At 52, Jonathan Blackwood stood motionless beside his mahogany desk, his steel-gray eyes fixed on the sprawling Phoenix skyline beyond. His real estate and development empire stretched across 4 southwestern states, generating revenues that exceeded $400 million annually. He owned shopping centers, luxury resorts, and entire residential communities. Yet all his wealth, all his power, all his influence couldn't purchase the one thing he desperately craved: a single word from his son. 9-year-old Christopher Blackwood sat cross-legged on the Persian rug in the center of the library, surrounded by an elaborate city he had constructed from building blocks. Each structure was positioned with mathematical precision, creating perfect geometric patterns that would have impressed architectural engineers. The boy's auburn hair caught the dying sunlight as he worked with the methodical focus that had bewildered every specialist who had examined him over the years. Christopher possessed perfect hearing. Multiple audiological tests had confirmed his auditory system functioned flawlessly. His cognitive abilities tested in the gifted range, with an IQ that placed him in the 99th percentile. Physically, there were no abnormalities that would prevent speech. The boy's vocal cords, tongue, and all associated anatomy were completely normal. He simply chose not to speak, and no combination of therapy, intervention, or pleading had altered this fundamental aspect of his existence. Jonathan often found himself studying Christopher's profile during these quiet moments, searching for some hint of what thoughts occupied his son's brilliant mind. What dreams did Christopher harbor? What fears might he carry? What questions burned inside him that he refused to voice? These mysteries tormented Jonathan more than any hostile corporate takeover or financial crisis ever could. "The car is prepared, Mr. Blackwood," announced Elena Martinez, stepping into the library with quiet efficiency. Elena had served as Christopher's dedicated caregiver and educational coordinator for 6 years, ever since Christopher's mother, Victoria, had perished in a private plane crash when Christopher was 3. Elena was among the rare individuals who seemed to comprehend Christopher's unspoken communications, interpreting his gestures, expressions, and subtle behavioral cues with an intuitive understanding that Jonathan envied deeply. Christopher's head lifted at the sound of Elena's familiar voice, his striking blue eyes, identical to his mother's, surveying the room before settling on his father's face. Jonathan experienced that familiar surge of hope and subsequent disappointment. For an instant, he believed Christopher might break his silence, might offer some acknowledgement or response. Instead, the boy rose gracefully from his position on the floor and walked to the coat closet, retrieving his navy blazer with movements that seemed far too mature for someone his age. They were scheduled to visit Phoenix Memorial Hospital for Christopher's quarterly consultation with Dr. Amanda Foster, a pediatric neurologist who had been working with Christopher for 2 years. Dr. Foster specialized in communication disorders and had developed innovative approaches for children with selective mutism and related conditions. The drive through Phoenix's evening traffic passed in familiar silence. Jonathan observed Christopher through the rearview mirror, noting how his son's attention remained fixed on the passing landscape. Christopher seemed to catalog every detail: the architectural styles of buildings, the patterns of traffic flow, the positioning of streetlights and signs. His mind appeared to be constantly processing and organizing information, creating internal maps and systems that remained forever locked away from the outside world. Phoenix Memorial Hospital occupied several city blocks in the heart of downtown, its modern glass and steel structure reflecting the desert sunset in brilliant oranges and purples. The building hummed with activity as the evening shift took over from the day staff. Jonathan had donated millions to this hospital over the years, funding new wings, purchasing state-of-the-art equipment, and establishing research grants. His name appeared on plaques throughout the facility, yet all his philanthropy felt hollow when measured against his inability to connect with his own son. Dr. Foster's office occupied the 8th floor of the hospital's newest wing. She was a woman in her early 40s, with kind eyes and an engaging manner that put most children at ease immediately. Her walls displayed children's artwork alongside her medical degrees and professional certifications, creating an atmosphere that balanced clinical expertise with warmth and accessibility. "Christopher, I'm so pleased to see you again," Dr. Foster said as they entered her office. She had learned long ago not to expect verbal responses from Christopher, but she continued to address him directly, maintaining the respect and dignity that every child deserved. "I've been thinking about that remarkable puzzle you solved during our last visit. I've shown it to several colleagues, and none of them could figure out your solution method." Christopher's eyes brightened slightly at the mention of the puzzle, and he moved toward the shelf where Dr. Foster kept an assortment of challenging brain teasers and logic games. He selected a complex, three-dimensional wooden puzzle that resembled an intricate cage with multiple interlocking pieces. "Ah, that's a new one," Dr. Foster observed. "I only received it last week. The manufacturer claims it takes most adults several hours to solve, assuming they can solve it at all." Christopher examined the puzzle from multiple angles, his fingers tracing the carved wooden pieces with delicate precision. Within minutes, he began manipulating the components with confident, purposeful movements. Jonathan watched in amazement as his son's hands seemed to dance across the puzzle's surface, each motion calculated and exact. "Extraordinary," Dr. Foster murmured, leaning closer to observe Christopher's technique. "The spatial reasoning required for this level of problem-solving is remarkable. Christopher, your mind works in ways that continue to astound me." Christopher completed the puzzle in less than 15 minutes, the wooden pieces falling away to reveal a hidden compartment containing a small carved bird. He held the tiny sculpture up to the light, examining its intricate details with obvious appreciation. The remainder of the appointment followed the established routine: physical examinations, cognitive assessments, and various exercises designed to encourage communication through alternative methods. Christopher participated with his usual cooperative demeanor, following instructions through actions rather than words, demonstrating his understanding through performance rather than verbal confirmation. Dr. Foster made detailed notes throughout the session, documenting Christopher's responses and behaviors. "I want to try something different during our next appointment," she told Jonathan as the session concluded. "There's a new therapeutic approach that focuses on environmental catalysts rather than direct communication pressure. Sometimes children like Christopher are waiting for a specific trigger, a particular person or situation, that represents safety and trust in a way that differs from their daily experiences." "A particular person?" Jonathan asked, his brow furrowing with confusion. "Breakthrough moments often occur with unexpected individuals," Dr. Foster explained. "People outside the immediate family circle, outside the medical establishment. Someone who represents a different kind of connection, perhaps someone who doesn't carry the weight of expectation or emotional investment that family members naturally possess." Jonathan nodded thoughtfully, though he struggled to understand the concept fully. Christopher had encountered hundreds of people throughout his life: medical professionals, teachers, family friends, household staff, business associates. If such a catalytic person existed, surely they would have appeared by now. They rode the elevator down to the main lobby, Christopher walking between Jonathan and Elena with his characteristic quiet composure. The hospital's evening shift was in full swing, with nurses heading to their stations, doctors making rounds, and visitors arriving for evening visits. The lobby buzzed with the controlled chaos typical of a major medical facility. As they crossed the main atrium toward the parking garage entrance, Christopher suddenly halted. Jonathan, lost in thought about Dr. Foster's suggestions, nearly collided with his son. Christopher stood perfectly still, his attention focused across the lobby toward the information desk area. A maintenance worker was replacing fluorescent bulbs in the overhead lighting fixtures near the hospital's main entrance. The man appeared to be in his late 50s, with weathered hands and graying hair visible beneath a worn baseball cap. His uniform shirt bore the name Robert Chen embroidered above the left breast pocket. He worked with methodical care, replacing each bulb with the attention to detail of someone who took pride in performing even routine tasks correctly. Something about the maintenance worker seemed to captivate Christopher completely. The boy took several steps in Robert's direction, then paused, turning back to look at his father with an expression Jonathan had never witnessed before. It wasn't confusion or withdrawal, but something that resembled recognition, as if Christopher had suddenly encountered someone he had been expecting to meet. Robert Chen finished replacing the last bulb and began gathering his tools. As he bent to collect his equipment cart, he noticed Christopher watching him intently. Instead of the polite acknowledgement most adults offered when they noticed the silent boy, Robert smiled with genuine warmth. "Good evening, young man," Robert said simply, his voice carrying a gentle quality that seemed to make the busy hospital lobby feel more intimate and welcoming. Christopher continued staring at the maintenance worker, and Jonathan felt Elena's hand gently touch his arm. She had noticed it too. The way Christopher seemed frozen in place, the intensity of his focus, the subtle shift in his posture that suggested something significant was occurring. Robert shouldered his tool bag and began walking toward the service elevator. As he passed near Christopher, he paused again, looking down at the boy with the same easy, unforced smile. "You take care of yourself, son," Robert said, and there was something in his tone, a gentleness, a complete absence of expectation or pressure, that seemed to reach Christopher in a way that years of professional intervention had failed to achieve. What happened next would replay in Jonathan Blackwood's memory every single day for the remainder of his life. Christopher's lips parted for the first time in 9 years. 4 words emerged, spoken barely above a whisper, yet crystal clear in the ambient noise of the hospital lobby. "You knew my mother." Robert Chen's tool bag slipped from his weathered hands, clattering to the marble floor with a metallic crash that echoed through the space. Wrenches and electrical components scattered across the polished surface, but Robert seemed oblivious to the mess. His face had drained of all color, as if he had encountered something impossible. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. Jonathan felt his knees weaken. Elena gasped audibly, her hand flying to cover her mouth. Several people in the lobby turned to investigate the commotion, but none of them comprehended that they had just witnessed what dozens of medical professionals had deemed impossible. "Christopher," Jonathan whispered, dropping to one knee beside his son, "did you just speak?" But Christopher wasn't looking at his father. His piercing blue eyes remained fixed on Robert Chen, who had backed several steps away, his expression a mixture of shock and something that looked remarkably like fear. "I don't understand," Robert stammered, his voice trembling. "How could you possibly know that? I haven't seen Victoria in over 15 years. The mention of Victoria's name hung in the hospital lobby like a confession waiting to be explored. Robert Chen stood frozen among his scattered tools, staring at Christopher with the expression of a man who had just witnessed the impossible. Elena moved closer to Christopher, her caregiver instincts overriding her amazement. "Christopher, sweetheart, can you tell us more about what you mean?" Christopher's mouth opened again, and more words flowed, hesitant at first as if he were rediscovering how to use his voice. Robert worked at the airfield where Mom's plane was supposed to be fixed. He tried to warn her, but she didn't listen. The color completely drained from Robert's weathered face. He looked around the lobby frantically, as if searching for an escape route. "I need to leave," he muttered, bending to gather his scattered equipment with shaking hands. "My shift ended an hour ago. I shouldn't even be here." But Jonathan was quicker. Years of high-stakes business negotiations had taught him to recognize when someone possessed crucial information. He stepped forward and placed a gentle but firm hand on Robert's shoulder. "Please," Jonathan said, his voice steady despite the chaos in his mind. "My son hasn't spoken a single word in 9 years. Not one syllable. And the first thing he says involves you and my late wife. There has to be a reason." Robert straightened slowly, his eyes darting between Jonathan, Christopher, and the growing number of curious onlookers. "Mr. Blackwood, I know who you are. Everyone in Phoenix knows the Blackwood name, but I swear I never met your boy before tonight." "Then how does he know about you and Victoria?" Elena asked, her voice gentle but insistent. Robert's toolbox clattered to the floor again, this time because his hands were trembling too violently to maintain his grip. The question had struck him like a physical blow. "That was 16 years ago," Robert whispered. "Your wife, Victoria, she was different then." She wasn't married to wealth and power, she was just a young aviation mechanic who cared more about safety than schedules. Jonathan felt the ground shift beneath him. Victoria had never mentioned working as a mechanic. In all their years together, she had presented herself as coming from a privileged background, someone who had always moved in elite social circles. Christopher stepped closer to Robert, showing no fear despite the man's obvious distress. She discovered the engines were sabotaged on 3 different planes. Small things that would cause failures during flight. You helped her document everything, but the company threatened both of you. Robert sank onto a nearby bench, his face crumpling with emotion. "Jesus Christ," he breathed. "How can a child possibly know about Phoenix West Aviation? That company's been dead for over a decade." The name struck Jonathan like lightning. Phoenix West Aviation had been one of his father's subsidiary companies, sold off in the late 1990s, along with several other non-essential business ventures. Jonathan had been in college when the sale occurred, focused on his studies and unaware of the details surrounding his father's corporate restructuring. "Phoenix West was owned by my father's company," Jonathan said slowly, the implications beginning to crystallize in his mind. Robert looked up at him with hollow eyes. "Your father's company was killing people, cutting corners on maintenance, falsifying inspection records, pressuring mechanics to sign off on aircraft that weren't safe to fly. Victoria and I tried to report it, but every time we went to the authorities, our complaints disappeared." Elena had been discreetly filming the conversation on her phone, recognizing the historical significance of not only Christopher's first words, but the revelations that were emerging. "Robert, what happened when you tried to report the safety violations?" "We were fired within a week," Robert replied, his voice thick with old anger and grief. "Blacklisted from the aviation industry. Victoria lost her mechanic's certification on trumped-up charges. I ended up working construction, then maintenance jobs like this one. We both had to start over with nothing." Christopher moved even closer to Robert, his young voice carrying an authority that seemed impossible for a 9-year-old. "But you saved the evidence. You kept copies of everything. The maintenance logs, the inspection reports, the memos about cutting costs, even when it meant risking lives." Robert's eyes widened in shock. "I haven't looked at those files in 15 years. They're stored in a safety deposit box that I've been paying for all this time, not even sure why I kept them." Dr. Foster appeared in the lobby, having heard about the commotion from hospital security. She approached the group with professional curiosity, mixed with concern for her patient's well-being. "Jonathan, Elena, what's happening here?" The security desk said there was some kind of incident involving Christopher. "Christopher spoke," Jonathan said simply, though the words felt inadequate to describe the magnitude of what was unfolding. Dr. Foster's medical bag nearly slipped from her hands. "He spoke? Christopher, this is incredible progress. Can you tell me how you're feeling right now?" Christopher turned to Dr. Foster with a calmness that seemed to radiate from within. "I feel like I can finally tell the truth, Dr. Foster. About Mom. About why she really died. About the people who have been lying for 16 years." The pediatric neurologist struggled to maintain her professional composure while witnessing what appeared to be an impossible breakthrough. "Christopher, these are very serious accusations. Can you help us understand how you know these things?" "The plane crash wasn't an accident," Christopher said, his voice growing stronger and more confident with each word. "Mom didn't die because of weather or pilot error. Someone wanted her dead because she was going to expose Phoenix West Aviation's safety violations." Robert stood up abruptly, his face a mask of anguish. "Victoria tried to contact me 2 weeks before she died. She left messages saying she had found new evidence that she was going to try again, to bring down the people responsible for those crashes. I was too scared to call her back. I thought if I stayed hidden, if I kept quiet, they'd leave me alone." Jonathan felt his world tilting off its axis. Everything he had believed about Victoria's death, about their life together, about his own family's business empire, was being systematically dismantled by his 9-year-old son's impossible knowledge. "What new evidence?" Elena asked, continuing to document the conversation. Christopher answered before Robert could respond. "Mom found out that Phoenix West wasn't the only company cutting corners. There was a whole network of businesses, construction companies, transportation firms, manufacturing plants, all connected to grandfather's corporation. All of them put profits ahead of human lives." The lobby had grown quieter, with people moving away from the intense conversation while still straining to overhear. Jonathan realized they needed privacy for what was clearly going to be a lengthy and potentially explosive discussion. "There's a private conference room on the 7th floor," he said. "We can talk there without interruption." Robert shook his head vigorously. "No, I can't be part of this. I've kept quiet for 16 years. I have a grandson, a daughter-in-law who depends on my income. If these people killed Victoria, if they've been covering up murders for decades, then talking to you puts my whole family at risk." "Robert," Christopher said, his young voice carrying a weight that seemed to compel attention, "Mom is still trying to protect you. That's why she waited until now, until you were here, until all the right people were in the same place. She needs you to know that staying silent didn't keep you safe. It just delayed the danger." Robert stared at Christopher with growing horror. "What do you mean, delaying the danger?" "They know you kept the evidence," Christopher replied. "They've been watching you for years, waiting to see if you'd ever try to use it. They think you're finally ready to talk because of some questions you asked at your grandson's school last month." Robert's face went ashen. "Tommy's been having nightmares about planes crashing. His teacher suggested it might be related to family trauma, generational anxiety. I asked her if she knew anything about aviation accidents that might have affected families in our community." "That teacher, Mrs. Davidson, her husband works for Meridian Security," Christopher continued. "The same company that's been monitoring potential threats to the Blackwood family interests for 20 years. Your questions triggered an alert in their system." Elena looked up from her phone. "Christopher, how can you possibly know about surveillance systems and security companies?" For the first time since he had begun speaking, Christopher hesitated. His young face showed uncertainty, as if he were struggling to understand his own knowledge. "I hear things," he said slowly. "Not exactly voices, but information, like radio signals that only I can pick up. They get stronger when I'm around people who are connected to Mom's story." Dr. Foster had been taking notes frantically, her medical training warring with what she was witnessing. "Christopher, from a neurological standpoint, what you're describing sounds like a form of hyperacute perception combined with what we might call unconscious information processing. It's theoretically possible that your brain has been collecting and analyzing data in ways that—" "It doesn't matter how he knows," Robert interrupted, his voice rising with panic. "If what he's saying is true, if they really have been watching me, then my family is already in danger. My daughter-in-law Sarah, my grandson Tommy, they could be hurt because of what I know." Christopher stepped closer to Robert, placing his small hand on the older man's arm. "That's why Mom chose tonight. That's why she waited until you would be here at the same time as Dad and Dr. Foster and Elena. All the people who can help protect your family and expose the truth at the same time." Jonathan pulled out his phone, his business instincts taking control despite the surreal nature of the situation. "I have resources, security firms, investigative teams, legal experts who specialize in corporate cover-ups. If your family is truly at risk, we can provide protection while we figure out how to use the evidence you've preserved." "The evidence isn't just about aviation safety," Robert said, his resolve beginning to strengthen. "Victoria found connections between dozens of companies, all of them subsidiaries or partners of your father's corporation. Construction accidents where safety inspections were falsified. Factory explosions where warning signs were ignored. Transportation crashes where maintenance was deferred to save money." Elena stopped recording and looked directly at Jonathan. "Your father's business empire was built on a foundation of systematic negligence that killed people." The words hung in the air like an indictment. Jonathan thought about his childhood, the luxurious lifestyle his family had enjoyed, the prestigious schools he had attended, the social connections that had opened doors throughout his life. All of it potentially funded by the systematic endangerment of innocent people. "There's more," Christopher said, his voice barely above a whisper. "Mom didn't just find evidence about the past. She discovered they were planning new operations, bigger schemes that would put thousands of people at risk. That's why they had to kill her before she could expose everything." Robert's hands were shaking again, but this time with anger rather than fear. "Victoria was the bravest person I ever knew. She could have walked away, could have chosen to ignore what we discovered and built a safe, comfortable life for herself. Instead, she kept fighting, kept trying to protect people she'd never met." Dr. Foster closed her notebook and looked around the group. "We need to involve law enforcement immediately. If Christopher's information is accurate, we're talking about multiple homicides and ongoing criminal conspiracy." "Which law enforcement?" Elena asked pointedly. If this conspiracy has been operating for decades, it's likely they have people inside police departments, maybe federal agencies. How do we know who to trust? Christopher turned to his father with eyes that seemed far older than his 9 years. Dad, there's something else about Mom's plane crash. Something about why she was flying that day and where she was really going. Jonathan braced himself for another revelation that would further shatter his understanding of his own life. Quote, "She wasn't flying to that business conference in San Diego like you were told," Christopher said. "She was going to meet with someone who had information about a new company that was planning to use the same dangerous practices that killed all those people. A company that was going to start operations the week after she died." "What company?" Jonathan asked, though he already suspected the answer would destroy what remained of his faith in his family's legacy. Christopher looked directly into his father's eyes. "Blackwood Development Corporation. The company you founded 3 years before Mom died. The company that's made you one of the most successful real estate developers in the Southwest." The lobby seemed to spin around Jonathan as the full scope of the conspiracy became clear. His own business success, everything he had built and was proud of, was potentially connected to his wife's murder. The weight of Christopher's revelation crashed over Jonathan like a tidal wave. His own company, everything he had built, every success he had celebrated, was potentially constructed on the same foundation of corruption that had killed his wife. "That's impossible," Jonathan whispered, but even as the words left his mouth, memories began surfacing. The unusually favorable zoning approvals for his early projects. The construction permits that sailed through bureaucratic processes that typically took months. The inspection reports that always came back clean, even when neighboring developments faced costly delays. Christopher's eyes never left his father's face. The night Mom died, she was flying to meet with a safety inspector named David Thompson. He had discovered that Blackwood Development was using the same subcontractors, the same falsified reports, the same cost-cutting measures that Phoenix West Aviation had used. Mom was going to get his testimony to add to the evidence she'd been collecting. Robert Chen stood slowly, his weathered face set with new determination. David Thompson. I remember that name. He was one of the honest inspectors at Phoenix West, one of the few who couldn't be bought. After the company folded, he disappeared. We assumed he'd been threatened into silence like the rest of us. Elena looked up from her phone, which had been quietly recording everything. If David Thompson had evidence about Blackwood Development, and Victoria was killed before she could meet with him, what happened to Thompson? Christopher's voice dropped to barely above a whisper. He died in a house fire 3 days after Mom's plane crashed. The fire department ruled it an electrical accident, but the timing wasn't coincidental. Dr. Foster had been observing Christopher carefully throughout the conversation, noting the remarkable transformation in his demeanor and communication abilities. "Christopher, I need to ask you something important from a medical perspective. Are you experiencing any physical discomfort? Headaches, dizziness, anything that might indicate the stress of speaking for the first time?" Christopher shook his head. "I feel lighter, like I've been holding my breath for 9 years and can finally exhale. The voices aren't as loud anymore." "Voices?" Jonathan asked, kneeling beside his son. "They've been with me since I was very small," Christopher explained. "Mom's voice, but also others, people who died because of the shortcuts and cover-ups. They needed someone to tell their stories, but I couldn't find my voice until tonight, until Robert was here to help piece everything together." Robert's hands clenched into fists. "How many people died because I was too scared to speak up? How many families lost loved ones while I hid behind my fear?" "You couldn't have stopped them alone," Christopher said gently. "The conspiracy was too big, too well protected. But now we have everything we need to expose the truth." "Heh," Elena stepped forward. "Christopher, you mentioned that your grandfather's corporation was at the center of all this. What happened to him? Where is he now?" A shadow crossed Christopher's face. "Grandfather Harrison died 2 years ago, but not before he made sure the system would continue without him. He trained replacements, created networks of people who would maintain the cover-ups to protect their own interests." Jonathan felt a chill run down his spine. Who's continuing this? Christopher looked directly at Elena, and for the first time since he'd begun speaking, his young face showed fear. "Elena, your phone has been uploading everything we've said tonight to a secure server. But that server isn't controlled by law enforcement." Elena's face went pale as she stared at her device. What do you mean? The app you've been using to record this conversation was installed on your phone 6 months ago. It was presented as a standard caregiver documentation tool, but it's actually surveillance software. Everything Christopher has said tonight, every revelation about the evidence in the conspiracy, has been transmitted to the people who killed Victoria. Robert jumped to his feet. You mean they know? They know we're talking about the evidence? Christopher nodded solemnly. They know Robert has the Phoenix West files. They know about David Thompson's evidence. They know that Dad is starting to understand the truth about his own company. And they know that I can somehow access information they thought was buried forever. Jonathan grabbed his own phone, his business instincts kicking into overdrive. We need protection immediately. Security teams, federal law enforcement, media coverage, everything at once to prevent them from silencing us. It's too late for that approach, Christopher said quietly. They're already moving. Robert's family was taken into protective custody 20 minutes ago by people claiming to be federal agents. But Sarah and Tommy aren't being protected. They're being held as leverage to ensure Robert's silence. Robert's face crumpled with anguish. My grandson. My daughter-in-law. They have my family? Dr. Foster stood up abruptly. We need to contact the police immediately. This has escalated beyond anything I'm qualified to handle. The police chief is part of the conspiracy, Christopher said. So are 2 city council members, a federal judge, and the district attorney. Mom discovered the full list of compromised officials before she died. Elena stared at her phone in horror. If they've been listening to everything, why haven't they stopped us already? Why let Christopher reveal all this information? Christopher's expression grew grim. Because they want to know exactly how much I know and how I know it. They're trying to understand if there are other children like me, other people who might be able to access their secrets. Once they're satisfied, they have all the information they need. He didn't need to finish the sentence. The implication hung in the air like a death sentence. Jonathan pulled Christopher close, protective instincts overwhelming his shock and confusion. There has to be a way out of this. Some legal mechanism, some authority that isn't compromised. There is, Robert said quietly, but it requires courage that I didn't have 16 years ago. He reached into his tool bag and pulled out an old flip phone, its appearance suggesting it had been unused for years. This phone contains contact information for 3 journalists who have been investigating corporate corruption for decades. They work for different publications, different media companies that aren't controlled by the same interests. Victoria gave me their numbers before she died, told me to call them if anything happened to her. Elena looked up from her compromised phone. Why didn't you call them after Victoria was killed? Because I was a coward, Robert admitted. I told myself that my testimony alone wouldn't be enough, that they'd just discredit me as a disgruntled former employee. But Christopher's revelations tonight have changed everything. We're not just talking about one company's safety violations anymore. We're talking about systematic murder spanning decades. Dr. Foster checked her watch. How much time do we have before they act against Christopher and his family? Christopher closed his eyes, as if listening to voices only he could hear. The people holding Robert's family will make contact in 30 minutes. They'll demand that Robert destroy the evidence, and that I demonstrate my abilities so they can understand how to replicate them. If we comply, they'll kill us all anyway to protect their secrets. Jonathan felt time running out like sand through an hourglass. Then we need to move faster than they expect. Robert, can you contact those journalists right now? Robert was already dialing the first number. Maria Santos, investigative reporter for the Arizona Republic. If anyone can move quickly on a story this big, it's her. The call connected, and Robert began speaking rapidly, explaining the situation while Christopher provided additional details that seemed to come from an impossible well of knowledge. Within minutes, Santos had connected them with federal agents from an anti-corruption task force that operated independently of local law enforcement. Elena had switched to using Dr. Foster's phone to coordinate with the genuine federal agents, while Christopher continued to provide information about the conspiracy's structure and the location where Robert's family was being held. The next 6 hours passed in a whirlwind of coordinated action. Simultaneous raids resulted in the rescue of Robert's family and the arrest of dozens of conspirators. The evidence Robert had preserved, combined with Christopher's detailed knowledge of the cover-up's operations, provided prosecutors with everything needed to dismantle the entire network. But the most remarkable moment came when Christopher, exhausted from hours of providing testimony, looked up at his father with clear, peaceful eyes. "Dad, Mom wants you to know that none of this was your fault. You built your company with honest intentions. The corruption was inserted around you, hidden from you, designed to make you unknowingly complicit. But your heart was always clean." Jonathan knelt beside his son, tears streaming down his face. "Christopher, will you keep talking to me? Will you tell me about your dreams, your thoughts, everything I've missed for 9 years?" Christopher smiled, the first truly joyful expression Jonathan had seen from him since Victoria's death. "Every day, Dad, we have so much to catch up on." 6 months later, Christopher Blackwood stood in a crowded courtroom, his clear voice cutting through years of silence and deception, as he provided testimony that would put 43 people in prison for crimes ranging from criminal negligence to murder. The trials continued for 3 years, resulting in convictions that dismantled one of the largest corporate corruption networks in Arizona's history. Families of victims received settlements that, while unable to restore their losses, provided acknowledgement that their loved ones' deaths had not been forgotten. Robert Chen used his portion of the whistleblower settlement to establish the Victoria Blackwood Foundation for Construction Safety, which advocates for transparent building practices and supports families affected by preventable construction accidents. Elena Martinez remained with the Blackwood family, but now as Christopher's advocate and educational coordinator rather than just his caregiver. She became a nationally recognized expert on trauma-induced communication disorders and the healing power of truth-telling. Dr. Foster published groundbreaking research about Christopher's case, revolutionizing understanding of selective mutism and the connection between unresolved trauma and communication barriers. While she never publicly discussed the supernatural elements of Christopher's breakthrough, she privately acknowledged that human consciousness contained mysteries beyond current scientific explanation. Jonathan Blackwood rebuilt his company from the ground up, implementing the most rigorous safety and ethical standards in the industry. He discovered that success built on integrity, while slower to achieve, created a foundation that could support lasting positive impact. Christopher continued to speak, but more importantly, he learned to listen, not just to mysterious voices from beyond, but to the living people around him who needed their stories heard and their truths acknowledged. On quiet evenings, when Christopher sat with his father watching the Phoenix sunset, Jonathan sometimes asked if he still heard his mother's voice. Christopher would smile and reply, "She doesn't need to speak to me anymore, Dad. She knows her message was delivered." Sometimes the most powerful truths come from the most unexpected voices, and sometimes, when justice finally prevails, even the departed can find peace. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hits the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out. And don't forget to subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.